Hello, I'm Chad Lavoie, Director of Support for HAProxy Technologies, and today we're going to be talking about health checks in HAProxy. Health checks are an advanced artificial intelligence system which analyzes HTTP requests from your visitors to determine how healthy they are. But that's not the type of health checks that I'm allowed to talk about today. So today we're talking about health checks from HAProxy to your backends to determine if they're up or not. This is over on the whole not a terribly complex system. It is just you open a TCP connection, you maybe send and receive some traffic, and then it determines if it's up or not. But as there are a lot of different types of backends and a lot of different types of applications, there are a lot of variable settings and questions that come up in this procedure. When I was testing this webinar, it came out long, so I'm probably going to run out of time. So if you have any questions that you're interested in answering, you're interested in me answering, go to the questions tab and type them in at any time during this webinar. I won't read it in real time, but when I'm about to switch sections or similar, I will take a look at what questions there are, and I will take a moment to answer any interesting questions, since I'm far more interested in talking about specific use cases than general slides, if anybody has anything they want me to cover specifically. So with that said, let's take a look at a very basic example of a health check before we get into the complicated configurations. So this is an example backend that has a health check. We see we have option HTTP check and a check keyword on the server line as the two active components here. This will use all the default actions, which will result in every 2 seconds a head request being made to slash. And if the backend server returns a 2xx or 3xx response code, HAProxy will determine it is healthy and it will be happy. If it fails 3 checks in a row, then it will mark it as down. Well, then we'll get to that in more detail in just a second. So let's go over what the basic checks in HAProxy are. We have the usual HTTP checks that we just looked at. We have TCP checks, which we'll cover in more detail later. We have specific checks for various non-HTTP protocols like Redis, MySQL, LDAP, Postgres. We have agent checks, which I'll cover. I have a slide on that later. External checks, which I do not have a slide on in this webinar, but you can basically write a shell script to have and then HAProxy calls the shell script with environmental variables set for the server IP, server port, that kind of thing. And the return code tells HAProxy whether it passed or not. I didn't put a slide in specifically because it's fairly specific to specific use cases, and the general setup settings aren't all that interesting. You usually just copy and paste the various things from the documentation. So I will not spend too much time on that, and you have to set various keywords to actually make it work. We have passive checks, which is basically HAProxy observing the traffic and determining if it's healthy or not. You do have to have some type of normal health checks also enabled in order to use passive checks. I'll cover that in more detail later. And then a couple of sort of health check related things I wanted to mention, but I do not mention anywhere else in this webinar. We have, if you want to have a server that tracks another server, so if you have 2 backends with the same set of servers in them, and you don't want to perform 2 sets of health checks, you can put on one of them, you can put track the backend name, server name of the other backend, and HAProxy will simply use whatever the health check status of the first server is as the status of the second server, which can reduce duplicate health checks and avoid conflicts where one backend thinks it's down and the other thinks it's up and that sort of thing. There's also redispatch and retry on. These are not really settings related to health checks specifically, but they sort of fit into the same thing. So option redispatch is something you'll see in a lot of most configurations, I would even say, where if HAProxy fails to establish a TCP connection to the backend, it will try a different backend for its usually third, though you can configure, or second rather, but you can configure its threshold. So that if a backend goes down, but HAProxy has not marked it as down yet, it'll try again. There's also retry on, which is a newer keyword. I think it was added in 2.0, which allows you to specify errors such as 500 errors or incomplete responses or that kind of thing, in which case HAProxy should try the request again, which again can trigger redispatch based upon the settings. You have to be careful with retry on because you can do things like submit orders multiple times, and you do not generally want to do that, but it is a useful setting for cases in which it applies. So with that said, let's take a look at some of the terms I'm going to be using for a lot during this webinar. Before that, I do see a question. Can HAProxy run some custom callbacks when one of the backends moves to down mode? The answer to that is no. You could use an external check script to do it, or you could there's also, I believe, the agent check has a setting where you can have HAProxy tell the agent what its health check state of the backend is, so the agent could do something. But built into HAProxy, it doesn't. Though in the next slide, I'll be covering how to monitor some of the options to monitor HAProxy. And we will talk, like you can use things like Alert Manager or Prometheus or scraping the CSV page in order to detect when a backend is down, or just use something like syslog watch to watch for the is down keyword appearing in the HAProxy logs. And if it sees the words is down, then you know a server went down and it can perform the action via our syslog. So the options of health checks of HAProxy itself, we have, so not directly related to checking the backends, but checking if HAProxy is healthy for a front end load balancer. So if you have a load balancer in front of HAProxy, or you're using something like DNS with Route 53, having a check HAProxy, and you want to fail it out if the HAProxy cluster is unhealthy, there are a bunch of options to do that type of thing. We have monitor URI, which allows you to specify a URL that HAProxy will always return 200 to in any HTTP mode front end. And I got a request to slow down, so I will, sorry about that, I will try to do that. The monitor URI tells it a URL to always return 200 to, which is, you can specify /check, and then you can tell Route 53 or whatnot to check, and thus you don't have to have failure of a backend that cascades through to your HAProxys getting failed out and that kind of mess. You can also use a monitor fail action to tell HAProxy when to mark the return of 500 for the fail, such as in this example, nbserv beapp is a fetch which returns the number of healthy servers in a backend. And if that is equal to 0, it can return 500, so you can have it fail itself out if a certain number of backends are unhealthy. I don't go into fetches in this webinar beyond this point, but we do have we have documentation and blog posts on fetches, which I believe cover nbserv. There's HTTP request return, which isn't really related at all to health checks. However, it allows you to return custom content from HAProxy. So if you want to return something specific, like, I don't know, an image or something for testing conductivity, you can use the HTTP return statement in order to do that. There's a stats page, which if you're not familiar with, we have a webinar covering and blog post covering the stats page and what all the columns mean on it. And if you put a semicolon CSV after it, you can get the CSV output, which has what backends are up, what backends are down, why they're down, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on some of the things the stats page will show you a little bit later. There's VRP RHI, which do health checks of HAProxy, for example, in Keep Alive D, which does VRP. There's a check script, which usually either checks for the PID of HAProxy or will curl the URL to check if HAProxy is fully responding. And in that case, that would be the monitor URI. Route Health Injection, our enterprise module has a feature where it will monitor backends, and you can specify which backends have to be up in order for it to announce a specific route. So if a given set of backends is down, it can retract a specific route, but if it can reach other backends, you can still have it serve traffic for them. And then for general checking what's going on with HAProxy, there's Prometheus, there's Alert Manager with its Alert Manager to send alerts for things. There's the real-time dashboard and that kind of thing. That's out of scope for this webinar. So with that said, let's take a look at some of the terms I'm going to be using throughout the rest of this webinar. Give me a second, I see some more questions, but I have to move the window. Will more skill lab webinars like this one be scheduled in the future regarding the HAProxy ingress controller features? I don't know of any specific plans for that that I know of. However, I will definitely make sure that marketing is aware it's of interest, and I can definitely assist in performing one of those webinars in the future. So for the keywords, we have rise and fall. You don't have to worry too much about where exactly these keywords apply. I'll cover that in the next slide where I have a diagram, and it's much easier. But so there's just, in case this syntax is confusing, default server can be put in a backend section or a default section. It applies the settings to all server lines. So you could put these on a particular server line, or you can put them on a default server line, and it applies to all of them. And the same thing applies to the check keyword that you saw in the first slide, where we were telling it to do health checks on that particular server. You can just put check keyword on default server line and apply to all of them. With that out of the way, rise is the number of consecutive health checks that that a backend has to pass in order to be moved from the down status to the up status. And fall is the number of health checks consecutive health checks that a server must fail for HAProxy to move it from the up status to the down status. As far as timing keywords, the default keyword, the only one that's set out of the box, is enter, which defaults to 2 seconds. So that is how frequently HAProxy will do health checks. We also have settings that apply in particular states. We have fast enter, which normally just defaults to whatever you have enter set to, but you can set it to something like 1 second here. Fast enter applies when a server is either partially up or partially down. Again, something I'll explain in the next slide. And down enter applies only when the server is actually down. So if a server has failed all its health checks, how frequently to do health checks. You can use this especially if you set down enter something like 5 seconds and you have an experimental server. You can set rise to something like 3,000. And thus you can make sure that the experimental server will stay failed out until you get into the office in the next morning if it goes down at all. It's just if you're worried about it flapping. One quick note about NBproc versus NBthread. NBproc is a little bit old by this point, but it is still very frequently used. So NBthread is the automatic mode. If you're using 2.0 or newer, it makes 1 thread per core. or you can specify the number of threads. But if you specify NBproc, it only uses processes. If you're using NBproc, every process has its own individual health checks. So if you have 500 backends and you have an inter of 2 seconds, every second you're going, and you have an NBproc of, I don't know, 2, you will, every second you'll be performing 500 health checks. And it can easily, and especially if you spin up all of your processes and multiple HAProxy servers at the same time, every 2 seconds they will be performing all of their health checks at the same time and can hammer a server down with health checks alone. If you're using NB thread, all the threads share the same health check status, so it only performs one health check for all the threads. So that isn't a problem in that case. We have timeout check 1s. You can, if you don't normally, timeout check is not specified, and it defaults to timing out the check when the next inter period hits. But if you specify a timeout check, you can have it fail a check faster if the backend hasn't responded in a given period of time. Spread check is a keyword that can be used to work around the hammering of the backends with a lot of HAProxy processes that I was mentioning before. It's a percent. The argument is a percentage, and it will randomly select the frequency of the, or exact timing of a health check, or within that frequency, in order to avoid having all your HAProxy servers either with multiple different servers or multiple processes hitting the back end at exactly the same time for their checks. So with that out of the way, let's look at that diagram that I've mentioned 500 times. We have, so the statuses, when you start HAProxy at first, all of your servers will appear in the init state, where it will schedule a health check as soon as it can to determine if they're up or down, whereupon they will enter this cycle. If the init state is a particular problem for a given use case, you can use the state file, which I'm not otherwise going to go into details on, but if you look in the documentation for state file, we have a documentation that covers how to use it, which tells HAProxy the state of the server as of the last time that the state file was captured. So it does not, you can skip the init state. But otherwise, in the init state just tells HAProxy it'll use the server until it completes the first health check and then determines if it's up or down. And then when HAProxy is running normally, it's always going to be inside of this cycle where a server will be either up or down, and it can be transitioning from one to the other. When it between the rise keyword and the fall keyword trigger, it can be somewhere in between, and when it's somewhere in between, fast enter will apply if it's either down going up or up going down, and down enter will apply if it's actually down. So you can configure that specifically. So a quick side note on maintenance mode, because it's very closely related to health checks and it is also a fairly common question. You can put a backend server into maintenance mode in order to not send traffic to it temporarily, and it will also not perform health checks to it. So if you're doing work on a backend and you just want to take it out of rotation, that is the easiest way to do it, rather than relying on the health checks to fail it out and potentially having clients get failed requests when they do it. There's a drop down, if you have stats admin, the stats admin keyword set in a stats section, you can, there's a drop down box where you can select the state of the server you want to put it in, and you can put the servers into the maintenance state or drain state. You can also use a curl request to hit the happy stats page, which does exactly the same thing as selecting from the drop down box and clicking the button, except you can do it with a shell script. It also required doing that curl request also requires stats admin. You cannot do a post, it will not accept a post request if you're not authorized to do that. Then there's also agent checks, which can tell the HAProxy to put the server into maintenance mode instead of just up or down, though it can do that as well. And then other states of note is drain. So the drain status, if you have a persistence cookie or persistence stick table, the requests will still go to that backend, but all new sessions that are where it generates a cookie or stick table entry will go to a different backend. So you can use that before you put a server into maintenance mode to get persistent sessions off of that server, and then once most of them are done and you're ready to begin work, you put into maintenance mode for an even softer entry to the health check state. Another question, is this webinar for Community Edition or Enterprise Edition? It applies to both of them. Nothing in here is specific to Enterprise, so this applies exactly the same, and all the settings are exactly the same for Community and Enterprise here. We have request routing options, which again are a little bit off from health checks, but are kind of important to understand health checks as a whole. You can put a backup keyword on a server line, and if all of the non-backup servers are failing their health checks, then the backup servers will be used. Normally it will only use, if you have multiple backup servers, HAProxy will normally only use the first backup server unless that first backup server fails its health checks, and it'll use the next one and so forth. Though you can specify option all backups, and it will enable all backups at the same time if your normal servers go down. You can normally, again, HAProxy will allow any requests that are currently in flight on a server that just failed its health checks to continue until they either conclude or fail. If you use unmarked down shutdown sessions, it will immediately kill all of the connections to a backend server when the backend server fails its health checks. So that's useful in cases where you know that when a backend fails its health checks, any requests that were, so a request is not a keep alive connection, but rather a connection where HAProxy has sent a request to the backend and is waiting for a response. If you know that that's never going to happen if a server fails its health checks, then you can use that just to speed up the failures or get to retry on faster, so it tries another server. There's option persist. This is pretty complicated, and it's not something you're probably going to actually deal with. However, if you want a particular setup, such as being able to request a path or group of paths or whatnot from a server, even if it is down, or even if HAProxy thinks it's failing the health checks, you can use configuration like this with either option persist tells HAProxy that persistent sessions can continue to use down servers, though generally that is not desirable. And normally what HAProxy will do without that is, if even a persistent connection, if a server fails its health checks, it'll just reassign it to a different backend server. But you can tell it to do that. And but if you want only particular connections to continue to persist, even if a server is failing its health check, the forced persist action will do that. So if you have these two lines here, the first line tells it to always use a server, even if it's marked as down, if the path starts with server check. And the second line says to use the server named in the URL parameter SRV if the path is server check. So you could put you could request /server check $SRV1 or SRV equals SRV1, and it would check SRV1 even if it's failing health checks. Useful for some particular setups. We have the redispatch and retries I already mentioned, and retry on all retryable errors if you want to retry everything. So the next question I get all the time is why? Does HAProxy think a server is down? Generally because there is some disagreement whether the server is actually down or whether everybody is or whether HAProxy is trying to make it up. So in order to determine if a server is actually down, usually the first thing I recommend doing is grepping for is down in the logs. That particular combination of words, notably with down is all capitalized, is going to be unique in the logs. The only case that it prints that log with that keyword is when a server was healthy and failed its final health check in the fall and became unhealthy. And that log entry has details of exactly or fairly close to exactly why the health check failed. In this example log entry, it got in layer 7, the layer 7 check failed, so it got a response, but it did not like the response because in this example I had a content check that was checking for a body response in the response that was not matched. If you mouse over the last check column on the stats page, it will give you a similar level of detail where it will tell you what happened. In this case, you mouse over the L4 con keyword and it will tell you that the connection was refused, or if it timed out or similar. And trying to reproduce the issue with curl and seeing if HAProxy is, if it's just HAProxy or if it's the backend is generally a good idea. Because it is not, even if you can access the backend directly from your browser, sometimes something is between HAProxy and the backend, and HAProxy is actually not being not lying about being unable to contact it, so that's useful. And then there's option log health checks you can enable for HAProxy to put an access log entry into its logs when it performs a health check. By default, no log entries are put in for health checks. It only prints if the server goes down or similar. And before we continue, there's a question, will this webinar be available for downloading? Yes, you will get an email. Everyone who registered for the webinar will get an email at the end of the webinar, or a bit after the end of the webinar once the recording has been prepared, with a link to view it. So if you continue to disagree with HAProxy regarding whether a server is healthy or not, Wireshark is a decent thing to try. After all, logging in HAProxy has been exhausted. It takes some getting used to for its interface, but if you run a TCP dump like the one here where it logs port 443, we can examine a particular TCP connection, and we can see that there was a protocol error from the backend and the SSL connection fell apart. That's generally something, if you see that kind of error, it's probably going to apply to both client connections and backends, and it's probably not a particular failure. A particular failure only for health checks, but it is something to note. And I believe, if I am correct, we're going to move on to now looking at HTTP checks in specific. So before that, we got another question here. Add on to why HAProxy has different TLS, trust, root CAs than your browser. But log only comes with handshake failure / error. That is a very good point. Yes. So if you're communicating with SSL to the backend, so you have the SSL keyword on the server lines, then HAProxy is going to only trust the certificate authorities that are in the CA file passed to it. And if you don't have a CA file, it will consider them all unhealthy. In a lot of configurations, you will see SSL verify none, and the verify none keyword just tells it to not care whether the backend certificate is valid or not. But that is certainly not desirable in cloud setups where you actually want HAProxy to verify it's talking to the real backend. We are actually coming fairly close to running out of time here, so I'm going to go through this with lightning speed just to get through the rest of these slides and give a general overview. So for HTTP checks, if you're sending things like host headers, it used to be you'd put them on the option HTTP check line, but that has been depreciated. So you have an HTTP send where you give it the various parameters. documentation has what all the parameters you can give it, which is a lot of them, and you can have it send post bodies and that kind of thing to backends as well. Where you tell it the protocol, the URI, the host headers, and if you want to use HTTP1, HTTP2, you can give it that, specify that as well. And you can use an HTTP expect string to expect. The string will check for what is in the body. It will look for OK in the body of the response. You can also, there's also an R status or status where you can specify which status codes are OK from the backend. Whereas by default, HAProxy will only accept 2xx or 3xx. You can make it you can tell it that 404 is a healthy status as well, if that is desirable. This is the syntax. One thing I should mention here is the HTTP disable on 404, which is a special keyword which tells it to put a server into maintenance mode if it gets a 404 response from a backend. That's useful if you have it checking a page, say /healthy, and is looking for the word OK, and before you put the server into maintenance, or before you put the server in maintenance, you can change it to change the content of that. You can just remove that page so it turns 404, and then HAProxy will drain the traffic from it. So you can just have a more automated deployment method of putting servers to drain. You can check as many URLs as you want, and they can be on different ports. So for this example, we have one check against the default port for /, and then a second one for on port 80, which this setup might be useful if you have both connecting to both 443 for SSL and port 80 for non-SSL. There's also SSL keywords for the connect line as well if you want to manually specify whether it's going to negotiate SSL. And in this case, you'll probably want to use the comment keyword on the expect lines or the send lines, so that if it ends up failing a health check, the last check or the log entries will say which of these various stages failed, so you know which URL failed if it wasn't a general connection failure. TCP checks, relatively pretty much very similar to HTTP checks, where we have just TCP check connect instead, and you can do a TCP check send to send arbitrary content. There's also a TCP check send binary, where you can specify encoded binary strings if it's not plain text. And then you can use TCP check expect string to expect what to get back. In this particular couple of lines, this would be equivalent to basically we'll just perform a get on / and expect a 200 response. There's no reason you would do that, because even in a TCP mode, you can still do HTTP option HTTP CHK will work fine. So even if you're not having HAProxy process the actual request and response in HTTP mode. So you generally would not do this, but if you have a custom protocol or similar, and HAProxy doesn't have a check for it, that's useful. We have the protocol specific checks that we talked about earlier. We have Redis, where it just sends ping, expects pong. We have SMTP check, which just expects a response starting with 2 after it sends a hello. LDAP check, which is pretty much similar to that. There's no arguments for it. There's PG SQL check for Postgres, where it sends a username and expects an authentication or error response. And then there's MySQL check, which again, you can give it a user optionally, and it will send an auth packet and expect a response. For both Postgres and MySQL, you do not have to specify a username if you don't want it to do that, if you don't want it to check the authentication part of it. A couple of other checks. This is the agent check that I talked about before, where you can give it use the agent check keyword and the agent port, and then it expects that the agent will return the word up, down, maint, drain, or optionally a couple of others like maxcon, the maxcon to set the backend to, or a percentage, which will HAProxy will reduce the server's weight by that percentage. So if you have an agent program running on a backend that's just like a simple Python script that's monitoring the system, and it determines that the system is getting close to overloaded, you can have it return 50%, for example, to reduce the weight on the server, so that HAProxy will prioritize the other servers in the backend instead of that particular one. And you can also have it adjust maxcon. If you have a method, you can query your web server and see how many more connections it's capable of handling right now, and you can dynamically set the maxcon in HAProxy based upon the return of the agent check. A little bit more advanced agent checks aren't seen all the time, but they are very useful in cases in which they apply. And finally, passive checks. These are often make it difficult to determine exactly why HAProxy failed a server out, and it can make things a little bit more complicated, so they are less commonly seen than straight health checks, but they certainly have their uses. You can specify, so you specify the traditional check. You need some form of health checks enabled, be it HTTP check, TCP check, whatnot. And then, because otherwise, HAProxy won't let you configure it otherwise, but it requires it, because if you have a server that went down because observe failed, it would otherwise be in an indeterminate state where it would never know when to bring it back up. And also, you could have an attacker or that attacker knew how to generate 500 pages. They could just mark a server as down by making the server return 500 with a couple of different IPs a few times. So you can tell it to observe layer 7 or layer 4. Layer 7 will look at the response codes that clients are getting from the backend. Observe layer 4, just make sure that the TCP connection or SSL, if it's negotiating SSL with the backend, passes. And then you specify error limit, which tells it how many consecutive errors from a backend responses are considered unhealthy. So if you have 500 responses, then you get a 200 response and 500 responses. That would not trigger this error limit, but if you get 10 in a row, it will. And then there's finally on error, where you can tell it what to do if a server, if the observe failed. By default, it is fail check, so it would be the equivalent of failing one of the health checks. And so if you have a fall of 2, it would still continue to operate. The server will continue to operate until either this keeps happening, or the normal configured health check also fails, and you can just have it speed along a health check failure instead of triggering it itself. But you can also just mark the server as down immediately when this error limit is hit, if so desired. And that's pretty much all of that. So we are a bit over time, but if anybody has any last minute questions, type them in now. Otherwise, you will have to find us online, and you can find various places to contact us. We are on Slack, Twitter. For enterprise customers, we have support@HAProxy.com. Happy to answer all of your health tech questions there as required. I did get a question that a small demo would be great, and that is true. A demo would be pretty nice. If I was short on things to do, I would have actually probably thought of that, but as I had too many slides for the amount of time I had, I did not think of that. But a demo is a good idea, and I will keep that in mind for future webinars. That a demo is good. And can you provide an example about external check? Let me exit out of this and see if I can't provide a quick example of what a external check looks like. So there are a few keywords that you have to do. You have to have an external check in the global section to enable external checks at all. But this is the command keyword that you use to configure what command to run. So you use external check command and then give it a command, and it will pass the argument of the proxy address, proxy port, server address, server port to the script, as well as setting a whole bunch of environmental variables about what its current state is to the script, and then it expects a 0 status if it succeeds. And as an example, if you use external check command bin true, it will always pass your pass the checks. There are a few others, option external check, there you have to set, there's the global external check, and then there's also you will probably also have to set insecure fork wanted to allow it to start other external processes. And if you're doing something like running ping, you may need insecure SUID wanted to allow it to execute that anyway. Generally, again, not a great idea. Another question, NBServe allows for creative uses. This is certainly true. So the NBServe fetch, which since I'm already here, I don't know if I can find the fetch that I want. There we go. You specify a backend name and it returns the number of servers that have failed, and you can do do all sorts of creative things using this fetch to determine how many servers your backend are up. You can do things such as if you have a web application firewall cluster, you can have it, but you can have a use backend line that uses the normal backend instead of the web application firewall if the number of servers that are up in the web application firewall are 0, and that type of thing for that. Is there a specific Ansible module to configure and monitor health checks? There is not a module that I know of to do that out of the box, other than, of course, the usual template configuration stuff. There might be one that I have not ran across, though. And another one about looking for a lab on the ingress controller and how to find what ingress annotations are available. That is certainly something that I will make sure to mention to marketing, and we'll try to do a webinar on that. And if a health check is failing, can we redirect traffic to a custom page? Yeah, there are a couple of different ways you can do that. You can either if you set an error file 503 in the backend, if all of the backend servers have failed their health checks, HAProxy will normally return a 503 error to clients. If you specify error file 503, you can override that with a custom page, anything that fits in an HAProxy buffer. It'll be truncated to the size of the buffer, so it is somewhat limited, but you can have a page of a handful of kilobytes to serve to clients that way. You have a few other options still. You can use the HTTP return if NBServe is 0 to do something. From a front end, you can use a backup server. So you just have a backup server that just is a simple web server sitting somewhere that just serves up your maintenance content. You could also do something fancy like an HTTPS redirect location, blah, 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 if NBServe is 0. So that in your front end, so you can do a redirect in the event all your servers are down. That is getting a little bit complicated, and it may make it hard to debug exactly what's going on, but in a good use case, it's a good option. And so that's the end of my questions. So I will end the webinar here. Significantly over time, and I do apologize for that, but I do hope it was helpful. And if you have any further questions, you can reach us on Slack or Twitter or email, and we will be happy to talk to you further. With that said, thank you all for your time, and don't have a good day. Have a great day.